In a desert where time forgot to move and the wind remembered everything, a man followed silence across the dunes and found a kingdom that ruled without a voice, a council that led without words, and a king whose final breath still shaped the world. This is not a story of power, but of presence, not of conquest, but of quiet. Welcome to Oruka, the city that listened. Long ago, before maps reached the edge of the great deserts, there existed stories of a city hidden beneath the sand. People spoke gently about it in the same way they might speak of a childhood memory, softly and with warmth. The city was called Oruka, and those who believed in it said it rested beneath the dunes, still and undisturbed, like a thought, never spoken aloud. Elias Warren grew up in a quiet town nestled among cottonwood trees and winding creeks. His grandfather owned a second-hand bookstore that smelled of old paper and cedarwood, and that's where Elias spent most of his afternoons. He sat cross-legged on the floor beside the travel section, thumbing through books with cracked spines and faded covers. While other boys collected baseball cards, Elias collected legends. His favorite story was about the sand-crowned king, a ruler who led with silence, never speaking a single word, yet somehow understood by everyone in his desert kingdom. His people, the story said, lived in harmony, not because they feared him, but because his stillness taught them to listen. The wind carried wisdom, the stones remembered history, and the sun marked time. There were no armies, no arguments, only the rhythm of life shaped by sand and stars. Elias never outgrew that story, even as he studied architecture and eventually worked on city planning projects in Arizona. The memory of Oruka stayed with him. He dreamed of wide courtyards half covered in golden dunes, of quiet streets where time moved slowly, and of a palace with open windows letting in the breeze, untouched for centuries. When he turned 40, Elias decided to take a sabbatical. He packed his notebooks, a sturdy canvas tent, and a leather-bound copy of his grandfather's stories. He hired a guide to take him beyond the familiar trails, deep into the desert, where the sky seemed wider and the land spoke in wind. The journey began at dawn. Elias and his guide, a calm man named Ramir, set out with 2 camels and ample water. The desert changed color throughout the day, pink in the morning, gold by noon, and deep orange by late afternoon. Ramir spoke little, but smiled often. Elias spent the long walks humming softly, sketching the horizon when they stopped for rest, and listening to the way the sand shifted underfoot. On the 5th day, the terrain became smoother. The sharp rocks gave way to softer hills. The dunes moved gently, like the folds of a sleeping blanket. Ramir pointed toward the south and said, "The wind grows quieter here. It is a sign." They continued walking until the sun touched the horizon. As they climbed the final dune of the evening, Elias saw something unexpected. The land dipped gently into a wide basin, and in its center stood what looked like the remains of tall, symmetrical stones. They weren't jagged or accidental. They had straight edges, smooth faces, and even spacing. A faint shimmer lingered in the air above them, not like heat, but more like stillness made visible. Elias felt no fear, only calm. He stepped forward, letting the sand shift around his ankles. As they reached the edge of the stone formation, Ramir placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Go slowly," he said. "Some places ask for silence." Elias nodded. The stones formed a circle with a smaller ring within it. At the center lay a platform, low to the ground, carved with symbols he couldn't read, but somehow found familiar. He knelt and brushed away the loose sand with the side of his hand. The stone beneath was cool and smooth. He opened his notebook and traced the design. Then something wonderful happened. A breeze moved gently through the stones, carrying with it a soft rustling sound, not loud, not strange, just present. It reminded Elias of a page turning in a quiet library. The breeze circled once, then stopped. And then the desert was still again. He smiled and leaned back. Maybe this was it, he said aloud to himself. Maybe this was the heart of the story. That night, Elias set up camp nearby. He lit a small lantern but didn't use it long. The stars shone brightly above, crisp and endless. He sat on a blanket and sipped warm tea, watching the constellations shift in slow procession. There was no city noise, no phones, no headlines. Only the pulse of the earth under his palms. He slept soundly, his dreams full of golden halls and soft sand paths. In the morning, he woke before sunrise. The sky was soft blue, the breeze cool and steady. He packed his things, leaving the site as he found it. Before leaving, he knelt once more near the central platform and whispered, "Thank you." It felt right to speak only once. As they journeyed back, Elias didn't speak much either. He sketched the dunes, wrote down how the air had felt, how the breeze had circled through the stones, and how peaceful the silence had been. There was no treasure, no glowing artifact, just the feeling of calm, of something old and kind resting quietly beneath the surface of the world. Weeks later, back in his hometown, Elias framed one of his sketches and hung it in his study. He called it the Whispering Dunes. Visitors sometimes asked if it was real. "It doesn't matter," he would say with a smile. "Some places are meant to be felt more than found." And when the nights grew still and the wind passed, gently through the trees outside, Elias sometimes dreamed again of Aruka, the quiet city that waited beneath the sand, where peace wore a crown and said nothing at all. The journey back from the stone circle did not feel like a return. For Elias, it felt like a quiet continuation of something he had only begun to understand. Though his feet retraced their path across the dunes, his thoughts moved forward, drifting, like the wind, carrying the peace of Aruka with them. He didn't speak much, nor did Ramir. They traveled with the ease of two men who had entered a place that left them lighter. By the time they reached the nearest village, Elias had filled half a notebook with sketches, reflections, and quiet observations. He spent a week resting there, sleeping on a cool mat near a courtyard, shaded by date palms, listening to the rustling of the leaves and the soft laughter of children playing with clay toys. No one asked him what he found in the desert, and he appreciated the silence. Some experiences felt fuller when left unspoken. When he felt ready, Elias packed his belongings once more and set out alone this time, not toward home, but deeper into the desert. He didn't follow a trail or a guide, he followed a feeling. The same whisper of stillness that led him to the stone circle now tugged gently in another direction. It wasn't a sound, it wasn't a thought. It was simply there, subtle and persistent, like the scent of rain before a storm. Each morning, he woke before the sun, folded his tent, and walked. The desert shifted around him, new shapes, new hues, but always the same quiet grace. He passed bleached bones of long-forgotten caravans, fossil-like rocks shaped by time, and lonely shrubs that bent low in the wind. He didn't hurry. He didn't expect anything. He simply moved with the rhythm of the sand. On the fifth evening, just as the sky turned to soft lavender and the heat left the ground, Elias saw something strange. At first, it looked like light. Not the harsh reflection of the sun on sand, but something softer, golden and steady, like the glow of candlelight behind a curtain. It shimmered low across the horizon, just beyond a wide ridge of dunes. He stopped and blinked. The light remained. Elias had read about mirages before. He knew how heat and distance could create illusions, pools of water that weren't real, cities that vanished when approached. But this didn't feel like that. It didn't dance or flicker. It simply waited, calm and sure of itself. He decided to walk toward it. As he climbed the ridge, the glow brightened. Shapes began to form. Arches, towers, domes. They were not solid, yet they weren't fading either. They hovered just above the earth like memories pressed into light. Elias stopped at the top of the dune and stood very still. Below him, spread across a vast open space, was what looked like a city made of gold. Its buildings were soft-edged, smooth and flowing, like they had been shaped by wind rather than by tools. There were wide courtyards, tall spires, and streets that wound gently through the open space. Everything gleamed, but not in a sharp or blinding way. The glow was warm, like morning sun caught in a blanket. There were no people, no movement, just silence and beauty. Elias descended slowly, his boots sinking into soft sand. As he reached the edge of the golden city, he noticed that the ground beneath his feet had changed. It was firmer, as though something lay beneath the surface, paved stone or ancient foundation. He knelt and brushed the sand away. Beneath it, a smooth tile revealed itself, polished and warm to the touch. He stood and walked through the city, his heart steady. He passed tall arches carved with gentle curves, as if someone had sculpted them with patience and kindness. He walked under domes that held no ceiling, yet seemed to shelter the air. The city glowed, but no shadow followed him. It was light without sun, warmth without fire. At the center of it all stood a small fountain. Its basin was dry, but the stone looked newly shaped. Around its edge were carvings of birds in flight and stars falling gently into bowls of water. Elias sat beside it, took out his notebook, and began to draw. As he sketched, he realized something, though. The city looked like gold. It didn't reflect his image. No matter how close he moved to the structures, no reflection stared back. It was as if the city welcomed his presence, but did not require him to define it. He closed his notebook and rested his hand on the edge of the fountain. The stone hummed softly beneath his palm, like the memory of music long forgotten. Elias leaned back and stared upward. The sky was darker now, dotted with stars. A gentle breeze moved through the space, and for a moment, the golden glow of the city dimmed, just slightly, as if it breathed. Then it returned, calm as ever. That night, Elias camped at the edge of the golden city. He didn't set up his tent, he simply laid out a blanket and lay beneath the open sky. As he drifted into sleep, he imagined walking through the city once more, this time with others beside him, people from all over, each walking in silence, marveling at the stillness. In his dream, the city whispered without speaking. It said, "Not everything must be touched to be real." When he woke, the golden city was gone. The sun had risen, and in its place was an empty basin surrounded by dunes. No arches, no fountain, no shimmer, just sand. Yet the sand felt different beneath his feet, cooler, smoother, like it had held something sacred and released it gently. Elias didn't feel disappointed. He smiled, brushed the sand from his notebook, and walked forward. He didn't look back. He knew what he saw, and whether the Golden City had truly been there or not didn't matter. What mattered was that it left something behind, not treasure, not answers, but peace. The desert, he realized, didn't offer destinations, it offered moments. And that morning, as he walked alone beneath the endless sky, Elias carried the golden light within him, not as proof, but as memory. A gentle reminder that sometimes the quietest places held the most beautiful truths. Elias traveled slowly after leaving the golden mirage. He didn't rush, nor did he seek out anything specific. He simply walked, watched, and listened. The desert had a way of becoming quieter after each discovery, as if each secret shared made room for a deeper stillness. He welcomed that silence. It gave him space to reflect, to breathe without expectation. The days passed gently. The wind rose and fell like a lullaby. The sky stretched wide and uninterrupted above him, and the stars at night arrived like old friends. He wrote in his notebook less, not because he found less to say, but because he understood more by simply observing. His steps were deliberate, his breath steady, and his mind open. On the 9th day after he saw the Golden City, Elias noticed a change in the terrain. The dunes ahead didn't rise into peaks like before. Instead, the land flattened, stretched out like a smooth, open hand. At its center, a cluster of broken structures poked through the sand. Some tall, others collapsed, their forms softened by time. Unlike the mirage, these ruins held weight. They were real, anchored, part of the earth itself. He walked toward them with quiet curiosity. As he approached, he realized the structures formed the outer edge of something larger. The walls, though worn and wind-scoured, had once enclosed something meaningful. They bore the faint markings of design, arches shaped with intention, stone blocks placed not randomly but with care. The air felt stiller here, more settled, as though even the wind had paused out of respect. Elias stepped through a narrow entrance flanked by 2 crumbled pillars. The path beyond led to a wide courtyard sunken slightly below the surrounding land. The sand here had gathered in drifts, soft and undisturbed, hiding much of what once stood, but something remained visible in the very center. A raised platform, square in shape, made of darker stone. He walked to it, his steps slow and respectful. There, in the middle of the platform, sat a throne. It was simple in design. No jewels, no ornaments, no towering backrest, just a stone seat, worn smooth by time, yet still firm and whole. The arms of the throne curved gently outward, like open palms. The base held small carvings, circles within circles, stars within squares, and though no one sat there now, Elias felt the presence of someone who once did. He stood in front of the throne for a long while, not speaking. He didn't sit. He didn't reach out to touch it. He only looked. The silence that surrounded the throne wasn't empty. It was full of patience, full of memory. It felt like a place that had waited calmly, gently, for someone to notice it again. Elias sat cross-legged near the base and took out his notebook. He sketched the throne and wrote a single sentence beneath it. The king said nothing, and they followed. He imagined the ruler who once sat there, not a conqueror, not a loud voice, but a still figure who led by presence alone. The carvings hinted at a different kind of leadership, one not based on control or fear, but understanding. A king who listened, who watched, who ruled not through commands but through trust. There were no signs of a kingdom in turmoil. No remains of battle, no weapons, no walls torn apart by force. Just wind, sand, and stone. Whatever happened here, it ended peacefully, or perhaps simply faded, like a lullaby after a child falls asleep. As the sun reached its peak, Elias stood and walked slowly around the courtyard. He found traces of a past life, the corner of a pillar inscribed with elegant lines, a half-buried bowl that once held water, and a worn path where countless feet once walked. He imagined the people who lived here, traders, farmers, poets, craftsmen, people who shared stories by firelight, who brought gifts to the king not out of obligation, but gratitude, a city that breathed in rhythm with its surroundings, simple, steady, serene. In one corner of the courtyard, Elias discovered a small alcove cut into the stone wall. Inside, he found a faded carving, a sun with rays stretching outward in every direction. Beneath it, a short phrase had been chiseled into the stone in an old dialect. He could not read it fully, but the symbols matched ones he had seen near, the fountain in the golden mirage. He traced the outline with his finger and smiled. It felt like a message left behind, not for tourists or historians, but for those willing to pause. He returned to the throne as evening approached. The light shifted across the platform, painting long shadows that reached outward like arms. Elias sat again, facing the throne this time. The silence returned, deeper than before. He closed his eyes and let it settle in. He thought about his life back home, the endless meetings, the structured plans, the way people measured time in emails and phone calls. He thought about the weight of always needing to say something, to have answers, to move faster. Here, none of that existed. Here, stillness held more wisdom than words. As the first stars appeared, Elias lit a small lantern and opened his notebook. Once more, this time, he didn't draw. He wrote. This is not a throne of power, but of patience. This is not a kingdom of gold, but of calm. The one who sat here taught not by law, but by example. Silence, when held with care, can be a kind of kindness. He let the page remain open beside him and leaned back against the warm stone of the platform. The air cooled and the sky turned silver with starlight. Somewhere in the distance, the wind whispered gently through the ruins, not as a warning, but as a song. Elias didn't need to see the king. He didn't need to know his name. He had found the throne, and that was enough. He stayed until morning, wrapped in silence, wrapped in thought. When he finally stood and began to walk away, he did not look back. Not out of indifference, but reverence. Some places, he knew, were meant to be visited quietly and remembered kindly. And in his memory, the silent throne would remain, not as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of how powerful peace could be. Elias left the throne of Auruka with a sense of quiet purpose. His steps felt lighter, not because he had found everything he came for, but because he had stopped searching. The desert no longer felt like a mystery to solve. It felt like a conversation, one where his part was mostly listening. He continued walking for several days, guided by instinct more than direction. The desert, once endless and overwhelming, now offered gentle variation. Low hills rose in the distance. Small clusters of desert. Grass appeared between ridges. The air was dry but not sharp. It held a softness that wrapped around him like an old coat. On the fourth day, Elias noticed something peculiar. The light changed. It wasn't the time of day. The sun still hovered above, warm and familiar, but the quality of the light shifted, as if it passed through a memory instead of the sky. Colors appeared slightly muted. Shadows faded more slowly. The world took on the gentle hue of an old photograph. He followed this strange softness and soon arrived at a shallow valley cradled by dunes. From above it looked like an ordinary basin, but as he stepped down into it, the sand beneath his boots gave way to stone, flat, cracked, and covered with a thin layer of dust. Elias knelt and brushed the dust away. Beneath it lay tiles, intricate, geometric, hand-set. Some formed repeating patterns, others depicted scenes, people seated in circles, animals grazing peacefully, constellations stretching across a blackened sky. He stood and looked around. The basin wasn't empty. Tidik's city of Oruka was still here. Not grand like the mirage, not buried like the throne, but preserved in fragments, walls without roofs, doors without hinges, and streets that still curved around empty courtyards. The buildings had softened into the land, half claimed by sand, but still whole enough to speak. He walked slowly through the city. There were homes clearly once lived in. Some still held furniture carved from pale wood, low tables, shelves, and smooth stone benches. In one he found a stack of clay bowls arranged neatly, as if someone meant to return and use them. Another had a faded mural on the wall, a night sky full of stars, painted in gentle strokes. Elias noticed something curious. No signs of collapse, no burn marks, no clutter, no rush. The people hadn't fled, they had simply left. Or perhaps simply stopped. He entered what looked like a central square. A dry fountain stood at its heart, surrounded by arches and open gathering spaces. Along the walls were inscriptions, softly etched, not commanding but welcoming. He couldn't read the language, but he understood the feeling. It was not meant to inform, but to remind. One inscription had a symbol beside it, a spiral surrounded by 4 dots. He paused. He had seen this before, on the throne platform. He sat by the fountain, opened his notebook, and matched the symbols. Yes, they were the same. This city had been part of the same world, not separate places, but chapters in a single story. As he rested, Elias became aware of something deeply unusual. Nothing moved. No wind stirred the dust. No birds flew overhead. Even the smallest sound, the shifting of his backpack, the soft brush of his fingers over the stone, felt louder than usual. Time itself seemed to pause. His wristwatch still ticked, but it felt out of place. The rhythm belonged to another world. Here, time did not pass. It stayed, held like water in cupped hands. He stood and wandered again, now more aware. In one home, he found a game board carved into the stone floor. The pieces were still in place. In another, a basket of dried herbs remained intact, as if someone had harvested them only days before. It was as if life here had paused mid-breath. Edure found a library, a long, narrow room with shelves carved into the walls. Most scrolls and pages had turned to dust, but one or two fragments remained, pressed between flat stones. The writing was delicate. So was the silence that surrounded them. He didn't take anything. He didn't disturb the order. Instead, he sat in the center of the library, closed his eyes, and let his thoughts slow. He remembered his childhood, those afternoons in his grandfather's bookstore, the smell of ink and wood, the way time had always seemed to stretch when he sat with a good book. That same sensation now filled him again. This city had not died. It had simply stepped aside from the flow of the world. It had forgotten time, but not in sadness, not in loss, in choice. Perhaps its people had followed the king's example. Perhaps they had learned to value the stillness, the quiet understanding that came not from progress or productivity, but from presence. Elias stood and walked back to the square. He took out his notebook and wrote, "They did not vanish. They did not flee. They listened so closely to the silence that eventually they became part of it." The sun dipped lower, casting long amber shadows across the smooth tiles. Still the wind did not stir. He remained until twilight. And then, as he prepared to leave the valley, a soft breeze returned. It moved through the city gently, lifting, a few grains of sand brushing past the mural, the fountain, the arches. Not to erase, but to breathe. The city had not asked for attention. It had asked only to be noticed gently. Elias climbed the dune and looked back. From above, the city nearly disappeared, its edges blurred by golden light, its paths hidden beneath centuries of patience. He whispered a soft goodbye, and then he walked on. He didn't mark the path. He didn't make a note on the map. Some places, he believed, were not meant to be found again, but to be remembered, like a dream that left you smiling when you woke. Uruka, the city that forgot time, now lived quietly in his heart. And with every step forward, Elias carried a little more stillness within him. After leaving the city that forgot time, Elias didn't feel alone. He walked in silence, but not in solitude. The desert seemed to remember his steps now. The wind curved gently around him. The sky appeared softer, the light more even. It felt as though the very land had accepted him, not as a visitor, not as an intruder, but as someone who chose to walk slowly, to listen, and to respect what he didn't fully understand. Elias often stopped for long periods during the day. He sat on the warm stone or on soft dunes and watched the horizon. He sketched what he saw, not always structures or landmarks, but shapes in the sand, shadows in motion, or the way sunlight fell across a single ridge. His notebook filled quietly just as the desert continued to share itself without haste. On the sixth day, after leaving the forgotten city, Elias reached a long, shallow valley that looked no different from others he had crossed. But when he stepped into it, the ground changed beneath him. The sand grew thinner, the earth firmer. He noticed that the wind no longer swept in from every direction. It funneled downward towards something hidden, something still resting beneath the surface. Paused. Something beneath his feet felt aware. He moved carefully, each step deliberate. The air held a faint warmth, not from the sun, but from the ground itself. He knelt and placed his palm on the surface. The stone was smooth. It didn't hum or glow. It didn't shake or respond, but it held something, a kind of presence, a memory waiting just below the surface. He took a small brush from his pack, the kind he used for light excavation, and began to gently sweep away the thin layer of sand. The stone revealed itself slowly, flat, polished, and wide. It extended farther than he could see, like the floor of a plaza or a rooftop, long buried. Symbols began to appear. They were not decorative. They were written with intention. Long, curving lines intersected by dots and arcs. They didn't form words he recognized, but they felt like language, not spoken, not heard, felt. He moved further across the surface and found a narrow seam, a line that suggested something lay beneath. A door? A hatch? A passage? He tapped it lightly. The sound returned with an echo. Not hollow exactly, but deep. He set his brush aside and lay flat on the stone, pressing his ear gently against it. At first, he heard nothing, just the gentle rhythm of his own breath. Then, after a long moment, something else. It wasn't a voice in the way people spoke. It didn't use words. It didn't whisper in his ear. It moved beneath the stone, not through sound, but through vibration. Like a heartbeat, like memory. Elias closed his eyes. And what he felt wasn't frightening. It was ancient, yes, but gentle. Not a command, but a story. Not a warning, but a welcome. He couldn't explain it in detail, only in feeling. There had been a voice once. A voice that spoke clearly, wisely. A voice that carried across the sands, calming storms and guiding people. But in time, that voice chose to quiet itself, to step back, to let silence speak. Not because it grew tired, but because it understood something deeper. That truth didn't always need to be said aloud. That voice still remained, tucked safely beneath the stone. Elias sat up slowly. He didn't dig. He didn't disturb the seam. Whatever lay beneath had chosen stillness, and he honored that choice. He opened his notebook and wrote, "Some voices echo even when they choose not to speak. This stone holds one such voice. It does not shout. It does not seek to be heard. And yet, I listened." He sat there until the sun reached its highest point in the sky. A soft wind moved through the valley, skimming across the flat stone like fingers turning pages in a book. The symbols seemed to shimmer faintly, not with light, but with meaning. Elias stood and slowly walked the perimeter of the space. He discovered more carvings, some circular, others forming patterns that resembled constellations. He traced, them with his finger, then placed his hand flat again on the surface. He whispered, "Thank you." The stone remained still. But within its stillness was a kind of peace he had only felt once before, when sitting beside his grandfather as a child, listening to stories told without hurry. He packed his tools gently and stepped away. He didn't mark the valley on his map. Some things were meant to be remembered quietly. He spent the night just beyond the rise, on a small patch of soft earth, surrounded by flowering desert shrubs. He cooked a simple meal, brewed tea, and sat beneath the stars. The wind moved gently, as if respecting the memory of what lay below. That night, his dreams were vivid. He saw a room of stone lit by lanterns that did not burn. In the center, a figure sat cross-legged on a low platform. Not a king in robes or armor, but a calm presence, ageless, grounded. The figure looked up, but said nothing. Elias sat beside him in the dream. No words passed between them. But he woke with a single thought. Silence can be a gift we offer to the world, not just a space we leave empty. The next morning, he wrote that line on the inside cover of his notebook. And with a full breath, he continued his journey, not in search of answers, but in gratitude for what he had already found. Elias awoke to the sound of stillness. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of quiet. A complete, balanced hush, like the pause between notes in a song. The stars had faded, and the sun was just beginning to warm the tips of the dunes. The desert, as always, moved slowly, as if respectful of its own silence. He packed his things with practiced ease. His boots, now soft with wear, pressed gentle patterns into the sand. The air was cooler than usual, as though the land had taken a long breath during the night and had not yet exhaled. Elias continued his journey, though he no longer asked himself where he was going. He trusted the desert to show him what needed to be seen. By midday, he found a small canyon hidden between two ridges. Its entrance was narrow, almost invisible from a distance, but the path within opened into a sheltered hollow. A single tree stood near the center, bent and wide-rooted, its bark pale from years beneath the sun. At the base of the tree sat a circle of stones carefully arranged, their surfaces smooth and clean. Elias stepped closer. These were not natural formations. They had been placed with intention. Around the stones, smaller markers were etched into the ground, symbols repeating in rhythm. He crouched and examined them. One symbol returned again and again, a spiral, interrupted by a horizontal line. He had seen it once before, in the silent city. But here, it was everywhere, on rocks, on the ground, even faintly carved into the bark of the tree. Elias sat down in the stone circle and opened his notebook. He stared at the spiral. It reminded him of breath, drawn in, released slowly. It reminded him of time, unrushed, unmeasured. And as he traced it with his finger, something inside him felt very still. He stayed there for hours. The wind didn't enter the canyon. The sun moved slowly across the sky. The silence deepened, not heavy or lonely, but thoughtful, like a room waiting patiently to be filled only with what truly mattered. Then he noticed something else. Near the far side of the canyon, half covered by stone, lay the remains of an ancient wall. It held up nothing now, just stood quietly, a fragment of memory. Elias approached and brushed the sand from its surface. The wall was covered in writing, dozens of small lines etched into the rock. It wasn't decorative, it was deliberate. Though he couldn't read the symbols, their form was rhythmic, organized. The lines felt like verses. Beside the main script was a carved image. It showed a man sitting cross-legged, hands open on his knees. Around him, others stood with heads bowed. Above them, the spiral hovered. Elias stared at it for a long time. There had been rules here, not laws to enforce power, but agreements, understandings, a way of living shaped by stillness. He took out his notebook and wrote, "The people of this place did not speak quickly. They listened, they watched, they allowed space between moments, and in that space they found peace." He sat by the wall as evening neared, and with the fading light, a story formed in his mind, clearer than anything before. The city of Auruka had once been vibrant, not with noise, but with balance. Its people practiced quiet, not as a rule, but as a way of honoring the world. Words were used carefully, movement was deliberate. Even decisions were made slowly, allowing time for thought to settle before choices took shape. And at the center of it all was a single law. It wasn't written in punishment. It wasn't enforced by fear. It simply existed, understood by all. Speak only when your silence has been heard. That was the law of stillness. It guided conversations. It shaped community. It invited patience. When someone chose to speak, the others listened fully, without preparing a reply, without hurrying the moment forward. And when silence followed, it wasn't awkward or empty. It was a part of the message. Elias thought about how different that was from the world he came from, where voices often competed, where silence was misunderstood as hesitation or even weakness, where decisions were rushed and opinions shared before they had time to grow into understanding. Here, silence had been honored, preserved, practiced, and now remembered. That evening, Elias remained in the stone circle, watching the light shift across the canyon walls. He didn't feel the need to move. He didn't speak. He didn't write. He simply rested, letting the quiet fill him, not as something to endure, but as something to embrace. When darkness settled, he lit a small flame and prepared tea. The sound of the boiling water felt almost musical in the deep hush around him. He drank slowly, grateful for the warmth, and thought of the people who once sat in this same circle. They had spoken gently, waited before answering, made space for one another to breathe. It wasn't a silence of avoidance, it was a silence of care. And that kind of silence, Elias believed, had not vanished. It still lived quietly in places like this, and perhaps in people willing to carry it forward. Before sleeping, he closed his notebook and whispered into the canyon, "May we all learn to wait before we speak." The wind did not answer, but the silence did. It held his words gently, folded them into the fabric of the place, and continued to rest, calm, unhurried, whole. The next morning, Elias rose slowly. He let the sun warm his face before he opened his eyes. The stillness of the canyon lingered in his chest, like a melody remembered even after the music ended. He packed his things gently, folded the blanket with care, and looked one last time at the circle of stones. It had changed him, not with drama, but with simplicity. He resumed his journey, following no trail but feeling drawn, as he often did, by the quiet sense that something waited ahead. These dunes became wider, flatter. They shimmered in the afternoon light like woven silk, gently rising and falling as if the desert itself were breathing. The landscape spoke without sound. Every ripple in the sand seemed to say, "Go slowly, watch closely, remember deeply." By the second day, Elias saw something unusual on the horizon, a collection of upright structures arranged in a curved line. They didn't resemble buildings or markers. From a distance, they looked like sentinels, patient and unmoving. As he came closer, he understood. They were statues, 7 of them. Each stood about 7 feet tall, carved from pale stone that had faded with time. They were shaped like humans but lacked faces. Instead of detailed expressions, their heads were smooth and featureless, yet each posture was distinct. One leaned forward slightly, arms at its sides. Another stood tall, hands joined behind its back. A third sat cross-legged on a platform, arms resting on its knees. Elias walked among them, circling slowly. They were not placed at random. They formed a half circle, all facing inward toward a central space, an open stone platform, barely raised from the earth. The wind quieted as he stepped into the circle. He stood at the center and turned slowly, observing each figure. Though they bore no faces, their presence was unmistakable. They watched, they waited, they remembered. He felt it before he fully realized it. This was a council, not of rulers, not of warriors, but of listeners. Each statue in its stillness offered a posture of attention, as though they had once gathered here not to argue, not to speak over one another, but to witness something important and to hold that moment in silence. Elias sat cross-legged on the central platform, mirroring the figure closest to him. He opened his notebook, but didn't write. Not yet. He closed his eyes. And in the silence, a memory rose, not his own, but one the desert seemed to carry. He imagined a meeting held under starlight. 7 figures seated just like these. A decision needing to be made, not about war, not about wealth, but about the future of their city. About the meaning of peace, about how to continue without losing what mattered. Perhaps they had spoken then. Perhaps not. But whatever they did, it had been done with care. Elias opened his eyes and looked again. One statue had its arm extended slightly as if pointing. To another across the circle, that one's head tilted, the only one that did. A third figure had its hands raised slightly, palms open. It was not frozen chaos. It was a frozen dialogue. A moment captured, not in action, but in reflection. Elias rose and walked slowly around them. As he studied the base of each figure, he found carvings, small, unobtrusive, but clearly intentional. A swirl for one, a single vertical line for another, a simple wave-like motion at the feet of a third. He couldn't translate them, but he understood each symbol represented a role, a way of thinking, a perspective. The council, he realized, had been formed not to represent power, but to represent balance. Different ways of seeing, different kinds of wisdom gathered in one place, listening to one another. He stood in the center once more, notebook in hand, and finally wrote. This was a council of quiet minds. They didn't fight to be heard, they waited to understand, and from stillness they chose wisely. He sat until the light began to shift. As shadows lengthened, he noticed one final detail. Behind the seated figure, tucked into the ground, was a small slab of dark stone. It looked different from the others, newer perhaps, or preserved. He brushed away the sand gently, revealing an inscription, longer than most he had seen. The script curved gracefully across the surface, and beside it, a spiral surrounded by 7 dots. He stared at it for a long time. Though he couldn't read the words, he believed he understood the message. To lead in silence is not to command, but to hold space for truth to rise. And when 7 listen deeply, one voice may become 1,000. Elias sat back and smiled. This council had not ruled by decree. They had ruled by restraint, by creating room for clarity, by trusting the power of a patient pause. Before he left, he stood in front of each statue and offered a simple bow. Not as ritual, not as ceremony, just respect. Then he walked slowly from the circle, his heart steady, his mind quiet. That night, he made camp nearby under a gentle canopy of stars. The breeze returned soft and cool. He lay back, eyes open, thinking of councils not made of stone, but of people, of meetings that didn't begin with words, but with listening. He wrote one last note before sleep. Let our leaders be shaped not by how much they say, but by how well they hear. Then he closed the notebook, extinguished the lantern, and slept deeply, the sand-crowned council standing quietly in the night behind him, guardians not of rules, but of reflection. Elias awoke just before dawn. The stars still lingered in the sky, soft and pale, like forgotten thoughts drifting across a quiet mind. He took a slow breath, savoring the cool air, and watched the horizon gently brighten. The wind, which had slept through the night, stirred again. It arrived with no rush, just a light movement across the dunes, enough to shift a few grains of sand, enough to remind him that time continued, even here. Elias sat up and turned toward the stone council. In the soft light, the statues looked different, less like figures frozen in time and more like companions watching the world wake up. He smiled and whispered a quiet farewell before continuing his journey. By mid-morning, the wind grew stronger. Not fierce, not harsh, just persistent. It moved steadily across the dunes, lifting spirals of sand that danced for a moment before settling again. It wasn't the same wind that had followed him before. This one felt older, deeper, not angry, but purposeful. It guided him toward a low ridge shaped like the edge of a bowl. Beyond it, he saw a flat stretch of ground broken by stone slabs and small mounds, remnants of a forgotten part of Oruka. As he stepped over the ridge, the wind swirled around him, not violently, but as if it wished to be heard. He descended into the hollow and noticed something remarkable. The ground was scattered with fragments, not debris, but pieces of once whole things. Carved lintels, fallen columns, shards of pottery, painted with the same spiral he had seen again and again. A few broken stones bore outlines of faces, eyes half-finished, mouths left untouched. The air here felt different, not tense, but full. Elias moved carefully, feeling as though he had entered a place not often visited. He reached the center of the space and found a broken pedestal. Atop it lay a stone tablet, cracked but still readable. The spiral was carved into it, but this time something new had been added, lines of wind curling out from the center. A symbol, perhaps, or a warning. He sat beside the pedestal and opened his notebook, and suddenly, in the presence of that wind, the story came to him. Not in a rush, but slowly, like a memory long buried. There had been a moment in Oruka's past when silence began to slip away. Not all at once, not loudly, but gently. A word spoken too soon, a decision made too quickly. A meeting that ended before everyone had been heard. Small things, ordinary things. And the wind, once a quiet presence, began to stir. The people noticed. They still remembered the teachings of the king, the guidance of the council. But life, as it often does, became busier. Time felt shorter. The art of waiting was replaced by the urgency of progress. One day, a man stood in the center of the square and raised his voice, not in anger, but in passion. He wished to be heard, and he was. But the wind, which had once carried soft breezes through the city, shifted that day. It picked up his voice and did not let it go. It echoed it through the streets, louder and louder, until no one could hear anything else. And so the wind became a curse, not by malice, not by punishment, but by reflection. It carried every spoken word farther than intended. It stirred restlessness in the air. Conversations became shorter, listening became difficult. Silence no longer stayed. It fled, chased by the sound of too many voices rising at once. The people of Auruka, wise as they were, understood what was happening. And so they chose stillness once more. They sealed parts of the city. They stepped back. They returned to the old ways, and the wind, sensing it was no longer fed by hurried speech, grew calm again. But it had left its mark. Not destruction, but remembrance. Elias looked around the hollow and saw it clearly now. This had been the place where words tipped the balance, where silence had been broken just enough to teach the city its most painful and most valuable lesson. He stood and let the wind pass through his open palms. It didn't sting, it didn't push. It simply moved around him, curious and calm. He wrote in his notebook, "Words have power not because they are spoken, but because they are chosen. The wind remembers everything. Let it carry only what is meant to last." As the sun climbed higher, he explored the edges of the hollow. He found quiet corners where people once gathered, places that echoed laughter, learning, even mistakes. Nothing had been erased. Everything had been left as it was, gently wrapped in time and wind. He stayed until evening, and before he left, he placed a single stone on the pedestal beside the broken tablet. Not to repair, just to acknowledge. That night, Elias camped on the ridge above the hollow. The wind continued to blow, not hard, not angry, but alive. It moved through the dunes with purpose, as though it still remembered its role, to carry echoes, to test stillness, to teach those who would listen. Elias wrote one final note before sleeping. "Let my words be few, my thoughts slow, and my silences full." And as he drifted into rest, the wind did not disturb him. It simply passed and whispered nothing. Morning arrived gently. The sun climbed slowly above the ridge, casting long beams across the hollow where Elias had camped. The wind had quieted again, returning to its familiar hush. Elias sat with a cup of warm tea in his hands and watched. The desert stretch out before him, wide, open, unhurried. He didn't feel the need to search for more. He had seen the golden mirage, walked among the silent ruins, listened beneath the stone, sat before the council, and heard the story the wind carried. But something within him whispered, one more step. Not to discover, not to claim, just to witness. So after breakfast he folded his blanket, placed his notebook carefully into his satchel, and descended the ridge. He walked east into the brightening day. The path wasn't marked, but the landscape opened before him with quiet intention, as if it, too, knew the journey was nearing its end. By early afternoon, he reached a long slope of sand broken by flat patches of stone. The light shimmered, faintly above it, as it had near the mirage, but this was no illusion. The ground held something different, a kind of pause, a waiting. Elias stepped forward and saw it. In the middle of a wide clearing stood a structure unlike the others, not grand, not hidden, just present. It was a throne. the same size and shape as the one he had seen before, but this one stood alone. No courtyard surrounded it, no walls, no platform, only the sand and sky and stone. The throne faced west, toward the setting sun, and sat slightly tilted, as if the earth beneath it had softened with time. Upon the throne sat a figure, not living, not stone, something in between. The body was still, wrapped in light cloth faded to the color of desert clay. Its posture was straight, its hands rested gently on the arms of the chair. The head was bowed slightly forward, the crown barely visible, beneath a thin veil of sand. Elias stopped at a respectful distance. He didn't call out. He didn't move closer. He simply stood, heart calm, eyes steady. This was the king of Auruka. Not a legend, not a memory, a presence. And he had never moved. He had never spoken. He had simply remained. Elias sat cross-legged on the sand and waited. The wind moved around them like a soft current. The silence, deeper than any he had known, surrounded them both. It didn't press. It didn't ask. It just was. And as he sat there, Elias felt it. The final thread of the story. The king had led not with voice or law, but with stillness. His breath had shaped the rhythm of the city. His silence had taught people how to hear one another. And when the world began to grow loud, he remained quiet, not in defeat, but in faith. Faith that others would remember. He didn't speak because he didn't need to. His life was the message, and now Elias was its listener. The king had ruled without ruling, guided without guiding, loved without demanding. And when the time came, he did not fight to stay. He simply sat and breathed, and let his silence carry on. Elias placed his hand gently on the ground and closed his eyes. And in the stillness, he heard something, not sound, not thought, just breath. One final exhale, not from lungs, from time itself. The king's last breath had not vanished. It had moved through the desert, into the stone, the wind, the symbols, the statues, the silence. It had reached the people who stayed and those who left. It had passed through centuries, waiting patiently for someone to hear it again. Now Elias had. He opened his notebook and wrote. The king spoke only once, and when he did, he said nothing. But his silence moved through everything. He placed the notebook gently on the sand, letting the last rays of sun touch its cover. Then he stood, not to leave, but to honor the space. He bowed, not out of duty, but gratitude, and he whispered, "Thank you." Not because the king demanded it, but because Elias meant it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the wind picked up just slightly. It circled once around the throne, lifted a few grains of sand into the air, and then stilled again. Elias turned and walked slowly back across the desert. Not back to a map, not back to a place, but forward into life, with the silence of Auruka resting gently on his shoulders, like a cloak of memory. He did not take a relic. He did not need proof. He carried the story now, and that was enough. If this quiet journey through Auruka moved something within you, stay with us. At Mute Stories, we tell tales that whisper rather than shout. Stories that breathe, pause, and leave echoes in your heart. Subscribe now and walk with us through silence, wonder, and meaning, one calm story at a time.